Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. Join us as we hear from prominent figures who have played pivotal roles as lawyers, negotiators, and diplomats in the quest for peace. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. This is the second episode in our special mini-series in which we focus on Syria, a nation that has been at the center of global headlines in the past couple of months. Today, I'm honored to welcome Ivan Nielsen, a former Danish diplomat with extensive experience in conflict resolution and constitution building, and an expert in human rights and international law. Ivan has held key roles spanning from the United Nations to the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Today, we will be drawing on his time with Denmark's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he served as Denmark's special representative for the Syria crisis, and also served as Denmark's special envoy to the Syrian opposition during the Geneva peace talks. We'll delve into his reflections on what is happening in Syria today and what he expects in the future. Ivan, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Many thanks, Paul, for this opportunity.
Well, let's jump right in. If you could do a scene setter for us and help walk us through, in a quick snapshot, the eclectic makeup of Syria's population, constituencies, ethnic groups, religious groups. Talk to us, why is it so complicated?
It's indeed complicated, but I should also add, perhaps we also actually contribute to making it complicated, because in response to your question, I think the first one-liner response would actually be to simply say that Syrians, first and foremost, see themselves as Syrians. They see their identity through that lens. And obviously, when we look at the demographics, there are many different ethnicities, religions, religious connotations, but that is seen through the lens of being Syrian. So the notion of citizenship may be the one that best capture it. And actually, just to exemplify that, back in the days, I can't remember exactly when, but fairly early into the conflict, I attended a Syrian meeting in southern Turkey, and there was a university student who came up to me, and I think I was the only international rep at that gathering. So he spotted me and he said, "I simply want you to convey one message to your own capital and to your diplomatic colleagues. And that is this whole notion of sects and division. This is first and foremost a very clever way for the regime to ensure its own survival, to split division and polarization within our societies. Until only a few weeks ago," he said, "I had no idea who my neighbor was, whether he or she was an Alawi or Sunni or Druze or Christian and the like." And somewhat, we subsequently saw, obviously, that the regime was very successful in portraying this division, also portraying, as we all know, very, very wrongly, this notion that he was the minority protector of Christians, protector of all sorts of different minorities, but it was clearly for political purposes. So coming back to where I started, and I think that's what actually also should give us hope going forward, is that there seems to be a genuine desire among Syrians, left, right, and center, now to rally behind this journey towards a new Syria for all, where they see themselves as Syrians and they want to work collectively towards that goal.
Well, Ivan, at the moment, Syria is under the de facto administration of the HTS, led by Ahmed al-Sharaa. Now, considering his public statements and very concrete actions thus far, which have been emphasizing exactly what you've said, Ivan, that the Syrians are all Syrians. They may have different identities in different constituencies, but they're first and foremost Syrians. And that part of Syria's strength is its pluralism and the inclusivity of these different constituencies. What is your assessment of HTS's ability to continue to move along that path of Syria for Syrians based upon inclusivity and mutual respect? Are you optimistic that it's going to play out in the way that we hope?
I'm not only optimistic, I'm quite optimistic. And perhaps before we start looking a bit ahead, and without obviously ignoring the many, many challenges ahead, and not least the long list of spoilers who really want to put a spanner in the wheel, let's also kind of just look a bit at what has happened since it all went crazy in November last year. Within a span of some less than 3 weeks, we have seen a delivery on the overall goal of the revolution, the departure of the not only Assad, but the Assad dynasty, which expands more than 50 years back. And I think it is immensely important to note that actually that somewhat unfolded in as almost as undramatic way as one could ever imagine. I'm not disregarding that there have been some incidents, both in the north and on the coast, but there are always individual incidents where some may, for private or individual reasons or otherwise, may have for reasons of revenge or whatever, have somewhat targeted some former regime loyalists or even members of a minority. But we have not seen anything systematic. On the contrary, we have seen that so far, what has been said has been what has been done on the ground. We have seen that the statements of assurance to minorities as the military operation was advancing, specifically targeting both Christians and the Kurds, was also what we saw in reality. But not only that, we have also seen that these individual incidents, and yet again, they should be condemned, they should be looked at, is exactly also what, let's say, the new Damascus has said, ranging from actually saying that there should be accountability, and also there have been a number of arrests taking place. So as we sit and exchange here today, I think it is even exceeding my optimistic expectations, what we have seen. Then looking forward, I think it also gives grounds for optimism that the different engagements, left, right, and center, in Damascus in particular, involves basically all segments of society. There have been meetings with minorities, meetings with business communities, meetings with civil society, meeting with political forces, etc. In what I would say somewhat that typical Syrian way that somewhat vouches so well if we can continue seeing Syrians working to get collectively towards the same goal. I should also say, so I think, yes, not only optimistic, quite optimistic, but obviously we would also like to see, for the sake of enhancing the chance of getting to the end state, a new Syria forward, that is not only contact and meetings, but it also extends to a bit of engagement, if not inclusion. But I'm not concerned about the timing of that as we exchange here today. This is day 37, 36, very, very, very early days. And I think at all times we should assess developments over time. And as long as it continues in the right direction, I'm not be the one advocating for a fixed straitjacket timeline. I'd rather look at developments over time and look at conditions.
Well, Ivan, let's delve a little bit into how it is that the Syrians build consensus. You and I spent quite a bit of time together in Geneva during the Geneva II and the Geneva III negotiations, as well as time together in Istanbul. And we saw firsthand how the Syrian opposition, it had a variety of acronyms, SNC, SOC, HNC, how the Syrian opposition built consensus with an eclectic array of constituencies, but always thought of themselves as Syrians. Can you share with us a little bit what you learned from interacting, engaging with, observing the Syrians as to how they go about building consensus among these diverse constituencies?
Well, I think then exactly the crux of the matter here is that those groupings, whether it was groupings within the realm of political opposition or whether it was entities within the civic space, obviously with the exception of very specialized groupings, they were not cut along sectarian lines. It was basically that broad spectrum where somewhat you included basically all segments of life, and not only in terms of ethnicity or religion and the like, but also from different sectors of society, whether it was the business or whether it was religious or whether it was tribal and the like. And I think yet again, Obviously, at the time where you and I were quite engaged, that time was fundamentally different. There was simply no conducive environment, whether inside Syria or surrounding Syria, for that to unfold. But I would also say, and it's something that may be a bit overlooked in all of this joy, I think all of those efforts, dating back to even Geneva 1, and for sure fast forward until even November last year, that we saw that many of these Syrians undertook, for instance, the political opposition, were absolutely essential to prevent that we did not see a slide in another direction. One concrete example, should, let's say, Syrians collectively, backed by certain parts of the international community, not have been successful in pushing back on normalization when somewhat that risk was really looming within the last 12 to 18 months, none of this would have happened. Then we would have lost the battle at that point in time. And I think obviously Syrians, rightly so, are not fully familiar with that because they didn't see it. It was not concrete stuff on the table. But I think that role that was performed throughout should not be underestimated.
No, I think the ability, you and I were in a working group, and we had quite a few conversations about this push towards normalization. And it was really impressive to see the Syrian opposition standing up in front of the train and saying, whoa, the normalization with the Assad regime is not the pathway to peace. And because of that, it kept the space open for this transition that we've seen.
Yes, exactly. And I do sense that it is acknowledged in the right quarters. And yet again, I'm not somewhat blaming Syrians for not being fully aware of that, because it didn't come their way. It is not a service you put on the table. It was somewhat a bit of a defensive objective that we had to make sure that we did not slide down a certain avenue, but not necessarily with bringing meaning that we were brought closer to the end state.
Well, Ivan, let's pivot and talk a little bit about the terrorism designation. The HTS is designated as a terrorist organization because of its roots in Al-Qaeda and then al-Nusra. It has distanced itself. It has proclaimed long ago that it's separated, and it's actually taken action as recently as this week against ISIS, but over its history of the last few years. Still, the United Nations, the European Union, the US, the UK have it designated as an organization. How do you see this playing out in the coming weeks and the coming months?
I think that's one of the key issues, if not key challenges going forward. Obviously, primarily resting within the international community, because that is there that decision has to be revisited in order for it to benefit, let's say, progress and developments on the ground. But perhaps I can broaden the question a tiny bit before getting into the specifics, because the way I see it, and without simplifying it unnecessarily, if somewhat this journey towards a new Syria for all is to succeed, and yet again, I am optimistic, Syrian efforts, Syrian engagement, Syrian dedication, all the ingredients are there, all the building blocks are there, then somewhat three tracks have to be advanced in parallel. The first track is obviously we do need to see security. The second track, we do need to see service delivery, health, education, communication, transportation, electricity. And the third one is somewhat the one we can call, and I struggle a bit to actually give it a label, because whatever label I put on it, it can be misunderstood. And I don't want to put it into a model. It's the whole civic stuff. It's politics, it's civic space, it is governance, it is social contracts, etc. Or some could call it transition, legitimate transition. If we are to succeed, and if we are to see Syrians and Syria succeed, getting to that end state, new Syria for all, there needs to be advancement on all three tracks in parallel. If you don't have security, you can forget about the rest. If you do not have basic service delivery, that at a certain time will lead to instability. And yet again, people may also lose faith in this new drive, this new energy and the like. And obviously the last bit is where somewhat you ensure that people, Syrians, left, right, and center see themselves represented in the new Syria. But then coming back to your question, the designation as a terrorist organization, and somewhat linked to that, the very, very wide sanctions regime, including affecting the interim government in Damascus, but also through, for instance, sectoral sanctions and the like, is clearly a stumbling block towards providing the resources necessary for advancing. The first bit, security, is one, but for sure the second bit, basic service delivery. So I really do hope that if the international community firmly have faith in this new Syria vision, that also there's a willingness politically and otherwise to find a solution so that you can actually channel the resources needed to provide services. The sooner the better. And I am quite, let's say, quite hopeful that they're thinking about it seriously. As we all know, there have been a series of meetings already. The next one is announced here late January, I think, in Brussels. But this cannot go quickly enough. And we also know that it's not only about political will. There's a lot of engineering about changing the framework around the sanctions and the like. Obviously, I'm not saying just with a stroke of a pen we should lift all sanctions. There are still many individual sanctions for blood on their hands, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the like. So we have to approach it in a nuanced way, but we also have to do it in a fast way.
No, both you and I have had experience with sanctions, and they're relatively easy to impose. A legal framework exists, but lifting sanctions is 2 or 3 times more difficult than actually imposing them.
Yeah, exactly. So this will also be a bit of a test because obviously, if the political will is there of a certain magnitude, I really hope that the engineering will not prevent it.
They can make it happen. A jobs program for lawyers. Government lawyers will be really busy these next few months. Ivan, let's turn a little bit to some of the challenges that will face Syria as it transitions to a new Syria for all Syrians. You mentioned a little bit some of those challenges. You've also mentioned spoilers. Could you dive a little bit more into what challenges will the interim government face, will the international community face, and who's out there nefariously seeking to spoil Syria's transition?
I think the spoilers fall into many different categories. So perhaps we can just take them in different ways. I think the spoilers, and luckily enough, the spoilers are those with the weaker hand currently. That's always comforting a bit because obviously the potential spoilers are those who have lost out the most in light of these recent developments. And so, for instance, Iran clearly and their environments and their, let's say, allies have somewhat lost out big time. And obviously, we should also not forget that somewhat what enabled this radical change within a time span of a couple of weeks was that the regime's 2 best friends, Russia and Iran, plus they neither could nor would continue investing in holding a safety net under the regime. I have argued, I think almost for the last 10 years, that on its own, the regime only became weaker and weaker. It was only because of the international friends they had, Russia and Iran plus in particular, that actually the regime was able to maintain power. So I think those should fit into a category of spoilers, but yet again, I'm not overly concerned now because they really have been weakened significantly, but one to follow. Secondly, I would also actually put, and it's not a spoiler as such, it is just an unhelpful contributor. You have also been engaged in so many conflicts and so many contexts where we've seen radical changes. And obviously now there's a massive international attention. There's a massive international, let's say, curiosity. And with that will soon translate into some kind of resources and willingness to engage. And I think, I'm sure you've also seen a number of, let's say, contexts where that engagement has actually either not been contributing in an effective or efficient way, or may even have somewhat been doing a bit of damage. And one of the key advice and key pointers I have to whoever I'm engaging with is that the international community at large, they should actually now, well, one, they should do a bit of soul searching, a bit of reflection, because actually many got the analysis so wrong. Secondly, the new Syria is fundamentally different from those who even followed Syria until a few years ago. You need to eat a bit of a humble pie, go a bit back and somewhat figure out, read the situation, analyze the situation, engage with Syrians to get the input and somewhat have a better picture of the state of play currently, instead of just jumping straight into doing stuff, whether it is well-intended or ill-intended. it may not be useful before we somewhat, as a minimum, know what we don't know. And so that's my clear advice. And the third one, building on that, is yet again, it doesn't qualify as a conflict spoiler in the conservative sense, but it can be unhelpful. Is I think it is time for the international community also acknowledge, if they are honest about supporting this route towards the new Syria forward, this cannot and should not be business as usual. Everybody has to rethink their approach, starting with key individual countries to also the UN, for sure, to the extent that they will actually be a collective vehicle going forward.
Ivan, let's delve into those lessons learned a little bit more. I know you spent quite a bit of time in Afghanistan. You've been a keen observer of Yemen, Libya, Sudan, where it's pretty much without exception gone the wrong way. These transitions have failed. They've backpedaled, in part because of spoilers, in part because of domestic situations, and in part because of the failure of the international community to actually apply best practices and best principles. What are some of the lessons you've learned from the chilling of the Arab Spring and your time in Afghanistan that you would like to see applied in Syria?
I think at least three comes to mind. The first one is that I think, and yet this is based on the premise, if we actually have faith and believe and we're optimistic that we are on the right journey, we have commenced potentially the journey towards the end state, and that success coming with it, then the time has really come where the international community should take the consequence of that and somewhat rally behind and support the Syrians collectively in their efforts, instead of somewhat bypassing the Syrians and somewhat keep their Syrian, let's say, linkage confined to that one-liner, talking point, Syrian-led and Syrian-owned. Let's be honest about it and do it in the right way. So that is lesson number one. Lesson number two is more on the political side. And I'm sure yet again, you have seen that so many times, that from the outside world, and sadly enough, not least from the West, Europe, US, and elsewhere, there is still this tendency of somewhat approaching it more or less on your own premises, your own terms and conditions in terms of concepts, terminology, labels, models, and the like. But yet again, if we are genuinely honest to the premise that we believe in this, the international community should not somewhat approach Syrians now and say, we can help with A, B, and C. They should rather ask, how can we help? And then a bit building on that is also this notion that we have seen when it comes to transition, in the lack of a better word. We have seen, and some countries obviously stand out, impatience, a rush, somewhat zooming in on artificial benchmarks instead of valuing the process itself. And I really see also a risk in when it comes to Syria, that some will soon say that, no, we need to have elections within 2 years. And yet again, elections should never, ever be time-bound. They should be conditions-bound and have to feature in a broader roadmap. Let's call it transition otherwise.
No, I'm glad you've said that, because there seems to be this emerging narrative and conversation about timelines for national dialogue, for elections, and it's conditions that need to be ripe, not just a calendar or a timeline.
No, and Al-Shara, he gave an interview, I think 3 or 4 days ago, when he somewhat shared a bit of a gist of what was in his mind, and he said that he could envisage that there may be a new constitution some 3 years down the line, and then some elections some 4 years down the line. And I heard some Western commentators say, no, that's far too late, and this is another sign that this will basically, you will delay the democratic processes and exercises. But I think, yet again, obviously, we have to put it as a risk to follow. But the premise is that we have faith in this. We have to approach it fundamentally different. And it can never be whether it's within 12 months, 18 months, or 24 months. And I would also say it's actually one of those where the timeline as envisaged in Security Council Resolution 2254, 18 months. Why don't we just forget that one a bit for now and rather look at the conditions instead of the timelines?
Yeah, there's no sense in having elections if it's not free, fair, if parties aren't established, if the parties don't have a way to reach their constituencies.
Yeah. And I would also add, we have to maintain the sequence of the steps in a transitional process. You need to have some an environment which is more legitimate. You may need a link to that to have a new constitutional framework. And only then it would actually also time-wise make sense to talk about elections. We cannot front-load elections because then they're confined to an event instead of looking at the before, during, and after.
Well, Ivan, when you and I worked together in Geneva and Istanbul, it was well known that you were regarded as, and I'll say this so you don't, the dean, so to speak, of the international community among the envoys. You had deep relationships with the Syrians. You had deep relationships with all of the envoys, and you shared with us some of your perspectives that the internationals should now be thinking about. But also you had an incredible depth of relationships with the Syrians, everything from your work with the White Helmets to the opposition leaders to Syrian civil society. And so basically you were touching on all of the parts of those individuals that were interested in Syria. Let's talk a little bit about the Syrians. When your Syrian friends ring you up and say, Ivan, whoa, amazing, positive transition. We're optimistic. We're also a little bit scared. What are you sharing with your Syrian friends about what they might be thinking about or should be thinking about?
I share the same one-liner analysis that I am optimistic, me being me, and they say the way I read the situation and engaging, as you said, with many different actors. But what is very, very encouraging for me to hear in response to that, obviously, and I also do not hesitate or make a secret out of, there are many challenges. This is another chapter of not only hard work, but very hard work if it is to succeed. So we better buckle up and really get to it. But what really gives me hope is that Syrians generally, they also have belief in what is waiting ahead. And there's this willingness, which I've not heard in the same way the last 10, 15 years, is actually willingness to work together on this journey I call the journey towards a free Syria for all. There's also willingness in that equation to actually, and you have also been working with Syrians for many years, Paul, that many are somewhat, let's say, looking at it from a more narrow perspective, either their own organization or their own individuals and the like. But there's generally an articulated willingness to partner up on this journey. And that's also why you may also have picked it up that Syrians are now talking much less about being in opposition or disagreeing. They talk about dialogue. They talk about joining hands and working together. And that's obviously the third pillar I mentioned before, the one we can call all the civil stuff. That's where we would like to see all of that, because the bigger that is, the more dialogue left, right, and center, the stronger the end state and more, let's say, sustainable the end state will be. So, and that is what gives me reason. It is just that, coming back to the first two pillars, we need some international support now to somewhat make sure that the first pillar and the second pillar do not make the third pillar impossible.
Well, Ivan, this has been intensely valuable and intensely useful. Let me end with just, was there a question you were hoping I was going to ask you, but I didn't, and now that you'd like to share your thoughts on with our listeners?
No, perhaps just building a bit upon what I mentioned earlier, I do think that, yet again, the international community, if they're genuine about this, they should engage in the right way, support in the right way. But I would also add that the Syrians, they deserve that the international community does a bit of soul searching, if not even reflection, about how they dealt with Syrians and Syria. Because it was not only that they disengaged and somewhat gave up, many actually, as you know, actively pursued a significant policy shift. And many were actually looking at, if one is to be very blunt, going back to Damascus and kiss the ring, even though they knew very well that analytically, unless and until you address the root causes of conflict, oppression, killing civilians, corruption, the whole lot, it will not take you anywhere good, and you're only going to see more suffering on the way. And I must say, it is actually it's almost, I don't know what word to use, but some of those who actually changed significant course of direction, they are actually probably the ones calling me the most often now to somewhat see if they can get into the equation again and somewhat. But I think it is always good to have a dialogue, but a bit of redemption, a bit of soul search, a bit of reflection would be useful as a minimum. And if it is not in public, that may not be possible or feasible, at least internally, because if we acknowledge that internally, then we have somewhat the stepping stone towards not doing business as usual.
Yeah, Ivan, diplomats, reflection, soul searching. That may be the tallest order yet.
And that should, I have to say, that should extend explicitly to the UN. Because the UN, if you do a survey among Syrians, how they perceive the UN, it really does not come out favorable. What we have seen, even the concrete footage about Syrians throwing shoes out the UN vehicles and the like, that is quite reflective of how the Syrians feel about the UN. So they also, in my view, they have to do the soul searching, the reflection, and perhaps also their own transition.
That's the transition of the UN. That's a whole new podcast series, Ivan. Yeah. Well, Ivan, I wanted to thank you for taking the time for this podcast, but also to thank you for the decade-long effort that you put into trying, during the Geneva negotiations with your representation in Damascus and your work with the White Helmets, and sticking with the engagement on Syria when so many others wandered off to engage on other issues. I know all of the Syrians that I'm close to, they all know you, they deeply respect you, and they're so grateful that you've been working this for such a long time. And I'm excited to see where your work takes you in the next couple of years, helping the Syrians make this transition. So it's been a real honor and privilege to be your friend and your professional colleague all these years, Ivan.
Well, thanks a lot, Paul, and well, thanks for this opportunity, but equally important, thanks also you and your team's contribution throughout, because all of those contributions added up. That is actually really possible to where we are today.